Hi everyone, welcome to Rendering Teardown section. My name is Simon. Today we're going to have a look at this exterior rendering. Starting with a composition, it's going to be quite straightforward in this case because as you can see we have a simple view, not frontal but slightly on the side, with a really simple rule of third that is thoroughly followed with a good deal of sky here, which is nice so that we get some negative space in the image. A really potentially interesting foreground here with a car, a bit of detail and a shadow, and a second plane with the facade. So it's pretty straightforward. I'm not sure there's anything to change on that case. I'm not a huge fan when you get really, like when you get the angle of your project too close from the edge of your image, but it's not a huge problem. In terms of lighting, if we switch on this, you can see that there's something interesting, but I think could have been done a little bit more, is that we have here an interesting foreground with the cast shadows of the trees we can actually see in the reflection here, so that's a good thing. The thing is, I think there's the value of our grays here are a little bit all the same, which, like, if you look at it, the building doesn't stand out much, and there's a huge discrepancy or a huge contrast between the mid-gray here and the super dark grays of the frames here, which is not something you, well, like you can have it, but here it looks a little bit too dark, I think. And maybe we might have to have a little bit lighter sky so that it sort of stands out a little bit more. In terms of lighting, again, there are some things that are maybe should be considered. I quite like this. I don't know if it's rendered or it might be this huge tree we can see here. So it's interesting to, once you get the opportunity to do it, to get some cast shadows, like soft shadows of nearby trees, to cast shadows on your project, because it will always be quite interesting to have this sort of soft shadows to sort of create contrast between and variation in light and in hues on your facade. Same goes for the foreground here. The thing is, the asphalt here is extremely dark, which is a little bit, it would be, like, the thing is, it's extremely dark and it creates really harsh contrast with the projects and with the cars here. So it would be, I think, more interesting to have a lighter asphalt so that you read better the shadows here, and that way you'll get like a softer and lighter foreground that sort of leads your eyes to look at the facade. So in terms of lighting, that would sort of be it. There's a couple of inconsistencies, like we have extremely soft shadows, extremely soft shadows here and extremely harsh or sharp shadows here, which is a little bit too much, I think. This is something you can easily change by tweaking the size multiplier of your sun, or just changing the sun size or whatever in whatever plugin you're using. The other thing is that these are like pitch black, which is not really natural. The other thing as well is that in terms of detail, you can see there's like ivy added on the facade here, but it doesn't cast any shadows. So even though it's sort of really close to the facade, you would have to duplicate the layer of your IV and slightly offset it and change the color to match the color of the shadow on your image. In our case, it would be really easy because we know that the shadow on the bricks would be the color of this shadow here. So we'll have a look at it later on. The main problem, I think, in this project is twofold. The first one is the glass material that is absolutely not accurate, and it's kind of odd looking, because the thing is, the main facade consists in two things. You have the brick material, which is well, it's pretty good looking, so there's nothing much you would do with it. Like if you had the opportunity, or you could sort of rework on the edge and maybe add a displacement map, but it would like completely change the render time. So that's okay. But the thing you cannot really get away with is to not add refraction in your glass panels. So basically, when it comes to glass, there are a couple of things you have to keep in mind. Basically, like a base glass material would be full refraction and full reflection, which means you have to see through properly, and you have to reflect, and it has to reflect properly your environment. So this means two things, and you have to use like a Fresnel map to sort of change the ratio between refraction and reflection, but that's pretty basic for a material. The thing is, it means two things. That since you have full reflection, it means you have to work on the reflection, on what's going to be reflected. Sorry. So here it's a good start because we can see there's this wall and there's the trees. The good thing is that the trees here sort of gives us the like the shadow we see here. We can know that these two are related, so that's a good thing. The other thing is that if you add refraction, it means you have to detail the inside. So what you can do, if you like, either way, you should never make perfect mirror because it doesn't look real. So especially for the interior of a project. So what you have to do is to detail a little bit the inside. What you can do if you want, like if you don't have time to actually detail the inside, is to don't be like full refractive on the material, so that you just get a glimpse of what's happening inside, but don't actually have to model too much and too detailed. But still, like the best way to actually get a realistic rendering is to actually model perfectly the outside and the inside, and tweak the glass material until it looks good. If you want to add a couple of, like this is the base material, what you can add afterwards is just use bump maps in your glass material, so that you have slight variation, because you know that like a glass plate is never going to be perfectly flat, so you can have slight variation in the surface, or in the flatness of the surface. And this means you can use like large noise maps and put them in the bump map. You can also add a little bit of chamfer, which would mean that you get a little bit of bulge on the outside near the edge of your window frame. Second thing you can do is add little variation in the reflection glossiness, so you can have fingerprints or scratches. So it's basically adding dirt maps in your glass materials. The thing you have to be careful with is to first not have like a tiling effect where you have like a couple of scratches and you can actually see it's repeating everywhere. Second thing is that you have to be aware of the distance you're working with, because if we are like about 15 meters away from a glass plate, you won't be able to see the fingerprints, but your rendering engine is still going to calculate them, and it's just going to create noise. So be careful about the amount of details you create in your materials, because it really have to be dependent on how close you are from your objects. Same goes with the variation in refraction and glossiness. If you want to create frosted glass or like imperfect glass, you have to play around with it. But the basic of the basics is really full refraction, full reflection. A couple of things we can say about detailing, I think, is regarding the I quite like there's something that is oftentimes overlooked in images, is that the plates of each cars is different here, and sometimes you can see like just ever motion plate or stuff like that, which is kind of annoying. So here it's pretty good to see this kind of detail. The thing is, and still going back to the glass material, is that way you could see potentially better inside your cars. The other thing really with the cars here is, well, I think there's a couple of problems. First one is, well, I don't know what FNB is, so, but the thing is, you have to, use cars that are sort of match the kind of people who would come to your place. So say if you're doing like a grocery store, you don't want to put like Ferrari everywhere, because it's just, well, I mean, like if it's a cheap grocery store, stuff like that, it has to match the kind of customers you're gonna have. Second thing is, here it might be a tiny bit too packed. Well, it's okay. Like it's basically cars are a little bit like populating an image. You have to be careful with the amount of people or the amount of cars you put in an image, because the image is about the project and about what's happening in it, and not really about, like, you have to be careful not to make it about people or about cars, because it's not really the most interesting part. Second thing I was thinking about is that since you have so many cars, it would be interesting to have people actually like inside the building, or maybe someone is just getting out of his car or something like that. Have something a little bit more lively, because here it's a little bit lacking on that aspect. There was something quite unconventional in the layer management here. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes, or it might take a little bit more, but to explain to you how I usually work and how you can actually play around with your file, basically. There's two things. Basically what I noticed is that when instead of creating just zones to work in, the file actually, like the actual part of the project is copied several times, which is not really how you would work usually. So what I just want to talk about is how usually I would work. Basically, you have your material ID here, so you just select your image, and instead of copying the file or the brick here, and for instance, you just go straight into your adjustment layer and click on what you want to change. So say it's a hue saturation adjustment layer, then you just drag and drop it in your color adjustment, for instance, and I'll just turn off that layer because otherwise it's not going to work. And here you can change the color. What I mean is that you don't have to copy the whole thing, because otherwise you're going to have less flexibility. The other thing that I find quite interesting when you're tweaking materials is that when you don't forget to take the what's its name again? Diffuse filter. Where is it? Noise. Well, sorry for being blind. So here's a diffuse filter. Basically, it's the material applied on your project or on each surface without any lighting. So what you can do with that is actually quite interesting, because say you want to contrast the brickwork here. So what you would do is I select the brickwork and I add a level adjustment or a curve adjustment, whatever you're using usually, and you can just play around with it. The thing is, it's going to apply the level difference uniformly on the white area. What could be more interesting is to actually so that's the first thing. What could be more interesting actually is to select the the area, go into your diffuse filter and actually copy it. So what you do is you make your adjustment layer, you keep the selection in your diffuse filter, you Control-C it, so copy it, you get into this one and you Control-V it, so paste it. As you can see here, instead of having a full white area, we have slight variation here. And it will be interesting because, as you'll see, if I put this one back, the variation are not the same. So here, if I change it like that, oh wait, I'm gonna do it differently. I'm gonna copy this so that we have exactly the same variation. So here's the variation with a full white mask, and here is the variation with the slightly more complicated mask. And in this way, you'll actually have way more control over what you want to do, because here it's just contrasting the whole thing, which is not that interesting. Whether here, it's actually contrasting each brick differently, and it's contrasting the cement or the in-between joints differently, which is sort of what you're looking for to get variety in your contrast. So that's a really good tip to think about and keep in mind when you're doing work. It is especially interesting with complicated diffuse filter. If you have like wood planks and stuff like that, you can really bring the veins out, or and fine-tune them, or lower the amount of veins just by using this technique. So really keep it in mind, because it's a really good post-processing technique. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to fine-tune the image and make a couple of changes, but I won't comment on it, and I'll get back to it with just commenting all the layers I've created and slight changes I've made. So let's do that. So here's the image after a tiny bit of tweaks. As you can see, there was just like, main thing is about the contrast. So here's just a bit of level to enhance a bit the contrast, and a little bit of dark burning on the shadows to enhance them, and a little bit of dodging on the asphalt to make it a little bit brighter. Of course, you would have to make it a little bit more like fine-tune it, but that's the idea. Then the idea about having like a tiny bit of warmer tone on the asphalt to make it a little bit more interesting, and have because the idea is that here you have quite low and long shadows, so your lights should be a little bit more warmer, because we're at the end of the day a little bit. I also moved a tiny bit the sky, because as you can see here, the idea I quite like here is to have this cloud behind the edge of the roof here, which sort of makes it stand out a little bit more, and we have less clouds on the left, which is, I think, a bit better. Here you can see it's a little bit burnt, but it's just a matter of tweaking a little bit the image. Still, the idea, I think, is to try to avoid to have like a perfectly blue sky, because it's always a little bit too saturated. Although it will look realistic, I always tend to desaturate it a little bit and reduce the contrast so that your image stand out a little bit more. Because if your sky is if there's too much contrast and saturation in your sky, it's actually gonna be like the balance in your whole image is gonna be not as good as it could be, because your eye is gonna be drawn to the most contrasted area, which will be the sky, which is not what you want. So obviously I cannot do all the changes. So if you imagine here having like a nice interior, like with a couple of artificial lighting, a couple of people, and a little bit more stuff happening around here, that would be much better. But in the end, as you can see, if I go back to the original image, it wasn't much like, it was just the idea of tweaking a little bit the existing layers, but all the base was here to make a really interesting image. So that'll be it for today. Thank you for listening, and hopefully you've learned some interesting tips and tricks in the video. I'll see you in the next teardown. Thank you guys. Bye.
Schneider.